Well, thank you everybody for being here. I'm actually surprised there's as many of you here tonight as there are on a nice Friday night in Bend, so thanks for taking time out to come listen. It wasn't that many years ago that I was sitting in seats just like yours. I was, as was said by Dylan and I got started as a 13-year-old, mostly in model airplanes, and once the slides are up, I'll show you some of that. But I was at that early stage thinking about what aviation might be like for me in my future. I just inadvertently discovered it. It wasn't in my family at all, but I had found out it was something I enjoyed, and I managed to live close enough to an airport that I was able to ride my bike out and spend time there. And so I was sitting there imagining what life might be. I had begun to think about maybe being an airline pilot early on in my days, and it turned out to, that part didn't happen, but the rest of aviation turned out to deliver to me the most extraordinary life I could have ever imagined. So part of what I want to do tonight is help you all realize how fortunate you are, being as young as you are and in the seat you're sitting in where you're embarking on this journey. And I can tell you with 100% certainty that aviation provides some of the most incredible experiences you can ever imagine having in life. And what I'm hoping to do in the talk tonight is share a bit about my journey and just in the hopes that you see some elements that maybe you choose to follow. I was able to see other people that had done amazing things in their lives, and aviation was part of it. And so I was able to, in many cases, emulate what they had done. So I want to spend some of the time doing that. I'll talk a little bit about AOPA. This is not just let me tell you about AOPA. I have just 2 slides in here, but I do want to tell you what we do and why I think we matter and why I think we should be part of everybody's aviation journey, whether you want to do it professionally or recreationally. And within the profession, there's so many different ways to make a living and a life in aviation. And then at the end, I want to share a little bit. I wrote a book a couple years ago that basically synthesized what I had learned over my many years in some pretty incredible experiences and both job and life opportunities, working with incredibly talented and successful people. And I basically distilled out what I had learned from those folks into kind of the key aspects of what it takes to live an inspired and fulfilling life. And so I'll share just a couple points from that. We won't have time to go through everything, but I'm hoping you'll find a few nuggets of insight out of that. So I live here in Bend, so it was not hard to be here tonight. I've lived in Bend since 2004 with my wife Lisa here, and we have 2 kids. Both of them went to Summit High School. And so I get a chance to fly, even though AOPA is based in Frederick, Maryland, so I commute to Frederick kind of every other week or so. I go out for 2 weeks and come back. But here I've got a few airplanes that I'm able to fly. This one's a Sea Ray, a little amphibious seaplanes that was up at that was the North Sister there. I was out flying a few months ago, and there was still snow in the mountains. But let's go ahead and jump on in. So a bit of the journey, as I described earlier, I started with model airplanes when I was 13, and kind of fell into that too. Just saw somebody flying airplanes down at a local park and stopped to watch and discovered that was something intriguing to me. So I started building models, and then discovered I liked airplanes. And I was living about 5 miles from the local airport down in the Bay Area in California. And so I started going out there after work, or after school, not work, after school every day, and would just ride between the hangars and look for hangars that were open and offer to help. So whether they were changing oil or gapping spark plugs or repacking wheel bearings or just an airplane needed to wash and wax, whatever it was, I would volunteer to help them with that in exchange for airplane rides. So by the time I was 16, I had enough flying time, enough experience to solo. And then between 16 and 17, there wasn't much I could do but just fly as much. And so a lot of the guys would just give me their planes. That one on the top right, there's a Volkswagen-powered experimental plane. The guy would just give me to fly and earn 3 gallons an hour, and I could just run around and fly and build time for almost no money at all. I would hang out at the airport and again try to buddy up to anybody I could. That picture in the bottom right there was a Learjet company that was giving type ratings to people, and I would just go sit in the back of this Lear 35 and fly around California. These guys would be doing V1 cuts and all these different things you do to get a rating in a Learjet. And I didn't ever fly it in that situation, but I got to sit in there for one and just experience what it's like to fly in a private jet. But I would sit between the seats and watch the instructor teaching the student how to do all these different things in a Learjet. And so I just learned a ton by absorbing. And then, by the time I was probably 18 in that bottom left picture there, I had already started I got my multi-engine radio, did my commercial instrument flight instructor, then pretty quickly did my multi-engine. That was my first year in college. I was down in Santa Barbara. There was a reason I chose Santa Barbara is there's an airport right next to the Santa Barbara airport, so I could go to school during the day and then ride my bike down and teach. And then the flight school had a Seneca, so I was standing next to there, so I got checked out in that pretty quickly. And as fast as I could, became an MEI, because as soon as I got my multi-engine instructor rating, I had money flowing the other way rather than me writing big checks to fly multi-engine airplanes. So we can do the next one. And I went on from there to fly lots of different airplanes. And one of the common themes you can see in these pictures was tailwheel. I did start in a tailwheel airplane, which has really played out well. I fly lots of airplanes that don't have tailwheel, and so it's not like I'm only doing tailwheel stuff, but having tailwheel experience really opened a lot of opportunities to me. In this case here, I did competition aerobatics for a big chunk of my life, and so both the pits that I used to own and then this little laser on the bottom right. I also started getting into warbird stuff, so I became a pilot sponsor with CAF, the Commemorative Air Force. It was $3,500 to buy in, and then it basically was my airplane to fly. And so I had a T6, I had to buy fuel for it, and I flew it for several years. I got several hundred hours in the T6, and then a person came along and asked me to join a group that has that P-51. And so I joined that about 5 years ago, and have now got a chance to fly that pretty much whenever I want. So you'll see it up here once in a while. I bring it up to Ben periodically. It lives in California, but getting that tailwheel time early on opened up a whole world of opportunity in these different interesting areas. I also happened to stumble into somebody when I was in college that was talking about his experience as an Alaska bush pilot. He was a physics professor by school year, so he taught in Santa Barbara, and then he would go up to Alaska in the summer, and kind of from late May through September every year he would fly bush planes. And it just got me thinking, and I just couldn't get it out of my mind, about how exciting would that be to be an Alaska bush pilot and go and land on glaciers and go out to gold mines and do all the things you do in Alaska. And I couldn't stop thinking about it, and so I finally just decided to get a one-way ticket to Fairbanks, and I flew up there and I just started going door to door. And prior to that, by the way, this will come up later in the talk, but I had sent probably 120 letters. I got the phone book, which at that time that you didn't have the internet as much as you do now. Took the phone book, and I sent letters to every charter operator across the entire state of Alaska, introducing myself, telling them how much flying time I had, and asking if they would be willing to consider me for an employee that following summer. And exactly 100% of them turned me down. And so, literally, I didn't get a single offer. But several of them did ask me one thing: how much flying time do you have in Alaska? And the answer was 0. The second one that was, are you in Alaska? And the answer was no, not at the time. And so it became clear to me that no one was going to offer me a job in the lower 48 if I wasn't there. And so I just bought a one-way ticket to Fairbanks, started going door to door, talking to people, introducing myself, telling about my flying experience. I hitchhiked down to Denali National Park, which is where Mount McKinley is. There, the main park ranger, the lead park ranger, made an introduction to a guy in Talkeetna, which is down in kind of south of Denali before you get to Anchorage. And I went down there and I got hired with K2 Aviation because I had lots of tailwheel time, and they were flying on and off the glacier with their Cessna 185s. And so I flew with them for a little while. The glaciers the crevasses open up, so they only do that for a part of the summer. And then I went down to Anchorage and got hired by another company that had spoken to me and was less negative than most, and said, look, if you're up here, swing by and talk to me. And so here I was in Anchorage, and so I went over and talked to them. And he hired me with the stipulation. He said, look, by now it was kind of June timeframe. He says, I've hired all my pilots, so there's a very good chance you're going to sit all summer and not fly at all. He said, but I'm willing to spend the money to get you on our 135 certificate if you're willing to sit here and be that backup pilot in case somebody comes along and needs a flight. And I'm like, well, that's a good deal. And by the way, at that point I probably had 40 hours of Alaska time, but not a lot more than that. And so I said, sure, I'll do that, I'll take that bet. And so they put me on the charter certificate in the 402, which is the silver one up there, and then the Seneca. And I sat for about an hour on that first day at work, and the call came in and they needed someone to fly out to a little native Alaskan village, and I worked every single day of the summer from that point forward. And you had these maximum 14-hour days, and I was using up every minute of every maximum day. I flew about 540 hours that summer, every single day flying. And what turned out is a lot of the folks that worked there, they lived there, they worked there, they've been working there for years. So the last thing they wanted to do was fly late into the evening or fly weekends. And I was like, I'll do it, I'll do it, I'll do it. And so I took every flight I could. And so it turned out, rather than sitting on the couch, being the backup pilot, I became kind of the main pilot all summer long. So I got a ton of flying time in Alaska. It's probably been one of the most exciting parts of my aviation adventure. I came back to California. I got hired for a while flying for John Travolta. He needed a right seat pilot in a Hawker jet. I had a little bit of jet time, and he doesn't always fly himself. He had a full-time pilot, and so I would fly when he didn't want to fly himself, which gave me some jet time. And then I got hired by a private equity company in Santa Barbara. So they had a Saberliner over there. I flew with an architect for a while. That was the Conquest up there, with the PE firm, private equity firm, had the Saberliner in the Citation. So I flew for them for about 5 years or so, and they flew all over the country, all over the Caribbean. It was kind of a lifestyle of the rich and famous for the guy who was big into boats and cars and planes and all these things, and so he used the jets to get around and go meet various boats either on the eastern seaboard or down in the Caribbean and then sail between islands. And so it was really fun. At that time, I was probably 25 in that picture. I did that for 5 years, so kind of 25 to 30 years old, was just going around. I just started to date Lisa towards the end of that. But otherwise, it's a perfect job if you don't have anybody at home, because I would go for 3 weeks at a time, do this whole tour down through the Caribbean, come back for a week, and then we'd do it again, back for a week, do it again. But a great experience, great opportunity to fly some cool planes and see the world. And then Ben came along. This was in 2004. It actually started in Sun River, so Lisa and I bought the house up in the top left out of the Sun River Airport, if you've ever been out there. That's 11 River Road. There's only a handful of airplane homes on the airport, but that was one of those dream life opportunities where I was working for McKinsey at the time. Lisa was riding horses up here at a horse show, and I came up thinking this was going to be rainy Oregon, and discovered Central Oregon, and it's not so rainy. And then we found that house was for sale, and so we bought that, moved into it. Kids went to school at the Three Rivers School in Sun River, and I would use that airplane you can see in the hangar to commute to work down the Bay Area. So even though at that point I had stepped away from trying to become a pilot for a living, and I'll tell more about that, but I wanted to be an airline pilot for a variety of reasons. That didn't work out. But I made a shift to business, and in that, it gave me the opportunity to fly kind of a lot of different airplanes still. Even though I didn't get paid to fly anymore, I got to fly a lot of cool stuff. So I got to fly to work every week in that Meridian there, and at that time I was at McKinsey, then went on to some other work stuff. We have our 2 kids. Our son worked for Wanderlust, so some of you guys know Wanderlust tours here, and so he was a guide for them for a few years, and that's our daughter. She's big into horses, working on becoming a vet, and now we have a horse farm out in Tumalo that we ended up moving out to after we sold the house out in Sun River. So we've been in the area for about 20 years now, and the AOPA thing was a little bit of a surprise, but a very good surprise. I already talked about the Sea Ray. And then there's the non-flying part of my life, and obviously the flying part was a big part for big portions of it, and it still is to this day. But when it became clear to me I wasn't going to end up becoming an airline pilot, I decided to basically burn a couple of years and go to business school at UCLA with the hopes that when I got out of business school, the airlines would be hiring. And the reason I didn't become an airline pilot is 2 things. 1, I had color vision issues, and 2, they were constantly going bankrupt or furloughing people. And every time I was at a place to get hired, they were going under. And so I just had to keep doing something else, which in hindsight was a blessing because I got to do so many cool, interesting things. But part of what came out of that business school thing is I ended up getting hired by a company called McKinsey & Company, which is a global management consulting firm. And so I got a chance to learn incredible things about business, travel the world, I went to almost every country in the world. Did that for 14 years. Google called, they hired me to run a global team for them. I was there for almost 7 years. And then the CEO of Cisco Systems called and wanted me to help drive a transformation they were going through. So I basically ended up with 28 years or so, almost 30 years of business work there. All the while, though, flying was a core part of what I was doing the entire way through, whether it was commuting from Oregon to the Bay Area or doing competition aerobatics or continuing to teach. I've kept my CFI alive to this day, even though I don't do it for a living. I still teach quite often. During that journey, I wrote this book called True North. I got a couple copies here, which was really this synthesis of everything I learned in my life being around so many amazing people and what is it about their lives that they had done that allowed them to build and lead these incredibly compelling, inspiring, fulfilling lives. And I'm glad I did it when I did it, because then about a year ago I got a call from the president at that time of AOPA, a guy named Mark Baker, who asked if I would be willing to be considered as the next president and CEO of AOPA. And I've been a member of AOPA for 37 years, and it's played a big role in my own aviation journey. And so I said, sure, sign me up to be considered, thinking the chances of it happening were not that high, because I was one of many they were looking at. And then it turned out that they wanted me to be the CEO, and I thought, what better chance to take the best of everything I've learned in aviation, everything I've learned in business, something I really care deeply about, and come back in and have a chance to lead AOPA and basically use its platform. It's an enormous organization, use it to try to help make aviation even more vibrant in this country than it already is. So that's how I got to where I am today. And part of what I want to make sure that I leave with you all today is just how diverse and interesting aviation is. Hopefully you got a taste of that when you saw my journey, but so many of the folks I talk to as I travel the country who are in programs like this, hey, what do you want to do? And they're like, I'm going to be an airline pilot, which reminds me of me. I was the same way. And it occurs to me that so few of them, of the folks I talk to, have an understanding or appreciation for how diverse aviation is. So airlines are great, it's why it's top left. I'm not against airline jobs by any means. However, there's so many other incredibly interesting roles to have in aviation, whether it's Alaska bush flying like I did, corporate flying corporate jets, aerial firefighting, agriculture. I'm going to a freighter Washington tomorrow to speak to an ag association about aviation stuff, medevac, rotor wing, fixed wing, and this is just probably a quarter of what's out there. So definitely one thing I invite you all to explore is all of the ways to make a life out of aviation. Whether you make a living at it or not, you can definitely make a living in every one of these and more. You can also have it be a core part of your life in so many areas that are just a ton of fun. Backcountry flying's a kick to go out and land in a grass runway out in the middle of Idaho and spend the night, or competition aerobatics is fun. It's an amazing community of people. The warbird stuff is amazing. There's just so many other cool, interesting things in aviation. So one thing I want to make sure that every talk I do, I help to widen people's aperture on all of the things that you can do in aviation. And of course, there's more than just flying, because there's tons of opportunity in maintenance, air traffic control, airport management, and so on. So the whole ecosystem of aviation provides so much opportunity in life. So if I talk about AOPA, just a couple of slides on that. As I said, I've been a member for 37 years. It really is an incredible organization. It's been around since 1939, so as was said, it's 85 years, with a sole focus on helping to make sure that general aviation remains vibrant and active and accessible to all of us. And for anyone in the room who's traveled the world, you'll notice there is no place like the United States when it comes to aviation. You go to Europe, it's maybe a tenth of what we have here in terms of access to airports, the ability to fly for relatively low cost. All these other countries have crazy fees. You pull your hangar out of you pull your airplane out of the hangar, there's a ramp access fee. You fly your flight plan, there's a flight plan fee. You land the airplane, there's a landing fee. You use ATC to get flight following, there's a fee for that. And the more you do, the more you pay. Here it's very simple. The more you fly, the more you pay through your fuel. So basically the taxes you pay through your fuel tax basically pay for the aviation ecosystem. And so we've structured it in the US to where it's really easy to use airplanes. There's 5,000 public use airports. Only 500 of those airports have a control tower. So 4,500 airports in the US have no control tower yet. They're completely accessible to all of us. Of all those airports, 3,500 have an instrument approach into them. When you go to Europe, if you don't have a control tower, like I was just in Frankfurt, I guess a month and a half or two ago, in Germany, if there's not a control tower, there cannot be an instrument approach. And so you're limited to going into Frankfurt and these larger airports that have control towers if you want to go in on a bad weather day. And the fees to go into those airports are just crazy. And so all the other airports like Bend or others are completely limited to day VFR essentially, which really limits it, right? The US, you can go anywhere pretty much any time in any weather and get into the vast majority of airports. So we've got an incredible environment for aviation that I want to make sure through AOPA we do as much as we can to fight to preserve that. So part of the ways we do it, one is helping people get into aviation. We've got a high school program, 30,000 kids across the US in our high school program. It's growing about 40% a year. We've got over $2.5 million in scholarships, or typical scholarships between $12,000 and $15,000. So that goes a long way towards various ratings you might be trying to get. We have career information, career services, help you understand what it's like to be an aerial firefighter, what's it like to be a medevac pilot or a fractional jet pilot or an airline pilot and so on. Because sometimes it's hard unless you happen to live next to somebody who does firefighting. How would you learn about what it's like to do that and what you might do in order to become one of those? So we work hard to help make that possible for you to learn those things. But preserving your ability to fly, we have legal and medical services. So you've got basically AOPA in your back pocket if you have an encounter with the FAA, which many people do. It might be as simple as, hey, you busted the edge of the TFR, or you took off and forgot to turn your nav lights on, or something, or you had a little incident, ran off the runway, the FAA gives a call. We have services that are just part of our membership where we help walk you through how to engage with the FAA in a way that improves the chance of good outcomes. And more often than not, it's a good outcome. And same on the medical side. It used to be the medical stuff was mostly being used by folks, say, over mid-50s into 60s as they have blood pressure issues, whatever it might be. Over 30% of the calls coming in are for folks under 25. They've been on various meds, maybe going through their teen years, anxiety, depression, all these things out there. And historically that meant you could not fly. There was no way to fly once you had any kind of challenge, mental health, call it challenge. And the FAA is dramatically changing their perspective on that, and AOPA works directly with the FAA. Our offices are in DC on those types of issues. So we can basically partner with somebody and walk them through that process and help them navigate the whole FAA medical environment to improve the probabilities of what comes out the back end as a positive one, that you get your license, you get your medical, you get to keep flying. So that's the preserving your ability, the world-class advice, Pilot Information Center, PIC, either chat or phone, answering virtually any question you could possibly imagine, whether it's how do I fly to Canada or the Bahamas or Mexico, whatever, or whether my engine's not been running right. If you happen to own an airplane, you can ask questions like that. If it's questions around, what kind, should I get a third-class medical, should I do basic med, and almost any question you can imagine asking is included. And then probably the most important part of what we do is the advocation. So we have people that walk the halls of Congress every day. We also have people in the regions at the state level who work with local airports to make sure, and with the Congress, so basically senators and House congressmen and women, to make sure that the legislative environment and the policies that we all have to operate under remain favorable to general aviation. And on any given day, there's some developer who would love to turn the Bend Airport into a bunch of condominiums, or there's someone who wants to put a tower up on a quarter-mile final because it's going to improve cell service or something, or there's a crosswind runway that needs to be upgraded and paved, and people are fighting to not let that happen because they don't want extra runways offered, and they'd rather see airports shutting down. And so we go fight to make sure that airports remain open. Or now that we're starting this transition to unleaded fuel, there's a lot of airports that are trying to shut, a lot of communities trying to shut airports down until we have an alternative to 100 low lead, which we will in about 3 or 4 years. But we fight to make sure airports can stay open and people can continue to fly and people continue to create a living like all of you are trying to do, so that we don't end up being victims basically of the folks who don't really understand aviation and don't appreciate the value it provides. And most people don't realize, they think it's a bunch of rich people just playing with their toys, and there's some of that, but as you all in this room know better than most, a lot of what happens out at airports like Bend are a young person in the left seat sitting next to only a slightly maybe older person in the right seat learning to fly because they want to become an airline pilot or do something important in their life. Or it's a medevac flight, Airlink, or someone going out with someone who's in need of medical attention over in Portland and then that flight's going out. Or in some cases, if you go to Redmond or Madras, it's an aerial firefighting flight going out to get rid of some of the fires around here. And here you have angel flights, pilots and pods. There's all these really good things that are good for communities that most people don't realize. And so a big part of what AOPA does is help to tell that story, so we build more basically enthusiasm and support for the little airport near their house that maybe they don't want to be a pilot, but they at least understand why that airport exists and why it's important for it to exist. So AOPA does all that, and I won't go into all this. You can go to the next slide here. These are the kinds of things, I won't go through this in detail at all, but we work on a lot of different things. We were the main force behind Mosaic. At the simplest level, Mosaic, it was announced this summer, an 8-year effort by the FAA to come up with a completely different certification standard that allows for aircraft to be certified at about 90% lower cost with still very high performance, 250 knots, retractable gear, constant speed propeller, and so on. So Mosaic was a major step forward in basically creating an affordable and high-performing aspect of general aviation. That just got passed basically in July, and it'll roll out over the course of the next year. It also lets somebody on a sport pilot license fly about 85% of airplanes out there. It used to be with a sport pilot license, you could only fly a light sport aircraft, an LSA. And with Mosaic, you can now fly a 172, an Archer, the Decathlon, Citabria, all those airplanes become available to somebody on a sport pilot license. ADS-B is a really important technology for helping us avoid mid-air collisions, but it's increasingly being used to charge landing fees, and so a lot of our work is to try to prevent that. We think ADS-B is a great technology for safety, and we hate to see it being used by companies to charge fees, because that basically is a disincentive to people installing this really good technology. So we're fighting that one. Big opportunity for the country to modernize their ATC. Our traffic control system's ancient, it's 40 plus years old, and parts of it have been upgraded, but most of it are still really old. So we're working closely with Secretary Sean Duffy and the head of the FAA and Congress and the FAA itself more broadly to transform ATC and bring it into the modern era. Basic med, AOPA was the engine behind basic med, and that basically, we got almost 90,000 pilots today flying on basic med. It allows you to fly without having to get a third-class medical. It dramatically lowers the cost and the friction of keeping your medical and being able to fly. It tends to be older people who get into that because it just gets to be a lot of work going back for your third-class medical. And there are issues that you'd be denied a third-class medical where you wouldn't be denied a basic med. And the data, after 10 years now, shows there's no difference in safety between basic med and a third-class medical. So we continue to fight to make sure that's even more and more available to more pilots. Costs are going up, that's insurance, that's fees from FBOs and others, so we're working to try to make sure those remain fair and reasonable, not zero. We never go fight for zero costs. It does cost to operate airports and to operate FBOs, but some of them have become egregious where some of the FBOs basically have like a monopoly position and they use that position to basically charge exorbitant rates. So we fight against that, and then the unleaded fuel transition I mentioned is really about how do we ensure we have an alternative to 100 low lead between now and 2030. And there's 3 fuel companies driving that, good progress, good technology advancements. I feel pretty confident we'll have an alternative. And for those of you who've ever flown an airplane on unleaded fuel, the Sea-Ray, that yellow airplane I showed you, if I fly it on unleaded fuel, I can go 100 hours between oil changes. If I fly it on 100 low lead, it's 25 hours between oil changes because the low lead fuel, the 100 low lead, just a much dirtier fuel. That lead contaminates the oil very quickly, requiring you to change it in a much more frequent interval. Also, the engines wear out a lot slower on unleaded fuel versus 100 low lead. So there's a lot of benefits to us as a community if we can get to an unleaded fuel alternative. And so you have 3 companies that are investing there. They're all making progress. They're all putting millions of dollars into that. And if all goes well, we'll have a good alternative, at least one, if not several, by 2030. So I'm going to shift to the last part of the talk, which is about my book, and I'm not going to go through all of these. If you were to have the book, there really are sort of 10 core things. And what these are, I'm going to go through 2 of them, but what these are insights that I've learned on my own journey, but they're hugely informed by having had the opportunity to be around just some incredible people who've built these incredible lives and done amazing things in their life. And I've interviewed most of them, and I've asked, what is it about you? How did you become like a guy who lived in town here, Jim Weatherby, as a 6-time space shuttle commander? Like, what was it you didn't live? How early in your life did you know? What were the choices you made? How did you think about things in order to improve the chances that that would be the outcome and you become the guy who had more space shuttle flights than anybody in the world? And so he's one example of the guy who was the producer of Pitch Perfect. Some of you would probably have seen the Pitch Perfect movie, Pitch Perfect 2, about acapella. I got to know that guy, and made his incredible life out of music and of all things modern day acapella. So like, how did he make that happen? And as I've gone through all these different people in sports and in business and entertainment and aviation, there were a set of common themes that started coming through those interviews that are essentially what I distilled into these 10 areas. And so what I thought I'd do is just pick a couple of them. If you go forward 1, I'll pick number 2 and number 6 on here. So yeah, go ahead. So being intentionally intentional. One of the things about people who build an extraordinary life is about getting themselves to take action. One of the things that keep people from doing something incredible with their lives is inertia and fear. It's easier to do tomorrow what you did today than it is to do something different tomorrow. And it's just so easy to keep going and keep going. And I would run into these people at McKinsey, which is an amazing place with super smart, talented, successful people. And so many of them were not particularly happy. And as you talk to them, as they got older and older, and you talk to some of these folks, 40, 50, it just, it's like, if you're that unhappy, why don't you do something else? And it became increasingly clear that the idea of stepping off the train and starting all over into something new is really scary to most people. Most humans are quite inertial. Again, they'd rather do tomorrow what they did today than to do something different. And so if you want to step off the path and do something different or follow a path that's inspiring and interesting, you do have to be very intentional about it. An example for me, for example, was that Alaska trip where I was sitting there thinking about it, going, wow, how cool would that be to be an Alaska bush pilot? Sending out letters wasn't enough. I took that action. That wasn't enough. And it's like, all right, I'm going to actually make this happen. I'm going to have to do something that gets me moving in that direction. And that something, in my case, was buy a one-way airline ticket to Fairbanks. And the easier thing to do, I was getting my master's degree in engineering. The easier thing to do would have just been to keep doing that. I had a scholarship. I was a teaching assistant. I really wasn't paying to get my master's. And so I had a pretty good gig, but I also just felt inside like, wow, what an extraordinary opportunity to go to Alaska and take on this cool adventure. And so for me in that case, it was taking that step, in this case buying a one-way ticket and starting that. And once you do that, all of a sudden that next series of actions starts to happen. And as I did that, it became increasingly clear there's a bit of a formula to how you make stuff happen in your life. And if you embrace the formula, you can actually make anything pretty much happen in life. And the way the formula works is first starting about what is the outcome I want to achieve, which is fairly straightforward, but it's worthy to think about what is the outcome you want in your life. And that simple example for me, I just couldn't stop thinking and imagining myself landing on glaciers and doing all these exciting things. But it could be I want to be a doctor, or I want to buy a house, whatever, there's some outcome. And there's three parts of this formula, the third one's the hardest one. But the second part is, okay, if that's the outcome I want, what are the behaviors I would do? Like, what would you see someone like me who is getting that outcome, what would they be doing every day? What are the actions they would be taking that would be consistent with getting that outcome in their life? And you can think, a simple one would be, if I want to be healthy, I'm going to try to stay healthy, what would someone who's healthy do? Well, they'd probably eat certain ways, they might get exercise. That would be something someone who's healthy is doing. So you can kind of do that. The third one, though, is the hardest part of that whole thing. Those first two are relatively straightforward, although still require some thinking. The last one, though, is what would the person who wants to be doing those actions that lead to those outcomes, what would they be thinking? What are the kinds of stories they would tell themselves to get themselves to do those actions? Because more often than not, what goes on between your ears is a story that stops you from taking those actions. It's too hard, I'm not smart enough, I'm not ready, I don't have enough money, whatever the story is, that's what goes on up here. The simple one for working out, I know I should be healthier. I know to be healthier, I should work out more frequently. And then I know what happens if I work back, okay, what would someone think that was going to go work out more frequently? And I know that. I would think I'm going to feel good, I'm going to have more energy, I'm going to live longer. At 5 in the morning when the alarm goes off, that voice usually says, hey, I know that sleep is really important too. And in fact, sleep is probably more important right now, today at least, than getting an hour of workout. And that story will cause the behavior, which is to pull the covers back over and go to sleep. As opposed to the story going, it's going to be awesome to see that sunrise today, because I can do it at 5 in the morning. And this is important. If I don't do it today, I'm not going to do it tomorrow because I'm too busy. I'm going to do it today. And I didn't do it on Saturday, so I'm going to do it because now it's Monday, whatever. I tell myself whatever stories it takes to get me to take the action that I know gets the outcome. And it's the same thing in everything that you do. If you can start to get clear on what is the outcome you're trying to get, work backward, think about what would I be doing? What would someone that's trying to get that, what would they be doing? And then the hard part, what are the stories I tell myself to get those things done? Jim Weatherby, the guy I mentioned, just lives right down the street here, the 6-time space shuttle commander, he told me, he knew at 10 years old he wanted to be an astronaut. And so he started studying, what do astronauts do? What are the backgrounds in astronauts do? Well, they get good at math and physics. And so he started really leaning in to math and physics. And then he found out, well, a lot of them went to the military, so he applied to the Air Force and the Navy, got into the Navy, so did that for a while. He knew the best people in the Navy could become test pilots, and most astronauts had been test pilots. So he studied on what they get good at as a pilot to become a test pilot. So he started doing those things. And so he basically just reverse engineered what most of the people he saw that had become astronauts, and then he started doing the things that they did, so he was acting in a way consistent. He knew the whole way through, he may not ever become an astronaut. That's a pretty small probability. But he knew it wouldn't be for lack of trying, and he knew that he would be, every time he got up in the morning, he would be doing things consistent with someone who was going to become an astronaut. And so there's a lot of power in thinking about any outcome you want in your life to building that formula where it just becomes natural. I want that outcome. If I want that, I'm going to do these things in order to get myself to do these things, because oftentimes we're our worst enemy. I need to have these stories in my mind that are going to motivate me to take the action to get those outcomes. So if you can master that, almost anything can happen in your life. It's really powerful. Climbing Mount Everest, learning how to ski, learning how to do something new you haven't done before. So a lot of power in that. Let me go to the second point here, which is how you spend your 168 hours. The genesis of this was I was sitting in Kitzbühel, Austria. I was with McKinsey at the time, and I was an engagement manager, and we were all sitting around complaining about how bad life was, because we were all working 18-hour days, oftentimes till 2 or 3 in the morning, and everyone was exhausted. And a lot of people were complaining about work-life balance, my spouse hates me, and I never see my kids, and all these things. But I noticed some people weren't complaining that often, and I was trying to figure out why, and it occurred to me that it wasn't like the people who weren't complaining somehow got 200 hours a week to get done what they needed to get done, and the people who were complaining only got 100 hours, it occurred to me we all have 168 hours to get done whatever gets done in a week, 24 times 7. So we all have 168 hours, and the difference between those who seemed to have life figured out and could make things work were the ones who most effectively managed those 168 hours. So maybe you're thinking, well, what would a good 168 hours for me, and it's different for everybody, how would I spend my 168 hours in a way that was inspiring and sustainable to me? So if you click it again, this was a chart I created like literally at 2 in the morning. And it's changed since then. This was done years ago. But I started thinking, okay, what are the categories down the left? I started with wellness. I know if I want to, I got to be healthy. At the end of the day, you got to find some way to be healthy. So I called it wellness, and I knew sleep mattered, and the doctors say 8 hours a night. And I was sleeping probably 4. I'm like, there's no way I'll get 8, but if I could get 7. So 7 times 7 is 49. I rounded up to 50 hours. If I could do 50 hours of sleep out of my 168 hours, that would be good. That would be a major step forward. I knew eating, I had to do that. I knew exercise would be fine. Maybe if I could do an hour a day, 5 days a week, that would be great. I didn't often hit that, but I knew that would be great if I could. I went through happiness, I called it, which was my me time. Like I knew it was really important. Aviation, that's why you see the first one is flying. I knew that I had to find a time, no matter how busy I was, no matter how many hours I had spent on the road. I was commuting to Frankfurt every week and back, and towards the end of my McKinsey career, I was going to Seoul 1 week, back for 3 days, Helsinki, Finland, back for 3 days, and then back and forth. And so I knew that even as busy as I was, I had to be able to find some amount of time to go flying. So that was basically part of the Saturdays, typically what I did. And Lisa, at that time, was kind enough to let me go do that, but she loved horses, so we had kids at the time, so I would take the kids and she'd go do horses like on Sunday. She would cover for me and I would go fly, and that was just like an hour over, kind of 3 hours or so at the airport, 3 to 4, playing, flying with my friends, formation flying, whatever, and then back, and that was my flying fix for the week. Social, I like people, reading TV, just mindless stuff. Relationships matter. It's kind of funny, it says Lisa 5. That was, for like real time with Lisa. It doesn't count if you're having dinner. I could also get some time eating dinner with Lisa. I could also get some time maybe socializing and so on. And so this is like real time. That'd be great. I'd be at 5 hours, because what that really meant was like we're going to have 1 date night a week. Like we actually go out on a date night every week. If we could do that, that would be great, because we didn't do that every week. Kids, 2 kids, 10, and so on. And then the work. And I said, if I could work 58 hours a week, at the time I was working 80 plus hours a week. And that was a lot, because what happens is when that becomes 80, it has to come from somewhere. We only have 168 hours. So if career became 80, that meant exercise probably went to 0. Sleep probably went from 50 down to 35, and so on. This whole thing basically has to flex to fit within 168. What was really, I think, powerful about this, I didn't often have weeks that looked just like this, but I knew what good looked like, and I also knew what to prioritize so that I could try to be as close to this as possible. And so, and I knew that there was some weeks when I just couldn't go flying, it just didn't happen. But I made a mental note, like I already said that was important, like for a good week I should find some time to go flying. And I just make a mental note that I gotta solve that, I gotta make sure I get that back in there. Or if I got some nights of 4 hours of sleep, I made a conscious note that was not good, that was not consistent with what mattered to me, what I had declared mattered to me. And so it really became an important touchstone to help me manage what, for me at least, was a sustainable and motivating and inspiring way to spend my time. And obviously you would have your own version of this, because you would all each have different priorities you put on your life. One thing I thought was interesting is the guy who created Pitch Perfect, when I was asking him about this, and he was going to school out in Boston, and he talked about having this love of music from a young age, and then really reimagining how a cappella could work. It could be something different than barbershop quartet. You could be singing modern day music, and he was the guy that discovered the pentatonics. For those of you who know any type of a cappella music, he kind of created the pentatonics, and then these 2 movies. And he talked about, I would say intentionally getting a C in French, but making an intentional, he felt every hour he spent in French to go from a C to a B to an A was an hour he could have instead spent becoming better at the music. And music was stuff he really cared about, and he was convinced music was going to define his life. And so he consciously chose not to spend more than X number of hours on French in any given week, and that was the proper trade-off. Because by definition, when you do something like this, you are declaring that you are willing to spend less time on some things than others. And so the power in this is getting really clear on where you want to spend your time and what things matter most. And I'd argue you should spend your time on the things that matter most in service of the life you want to build. And very often people end up spending their time on the things that someone else wants them to do. And they're not very clear on what matters to them or where they're trying to go. And so their 168 hours gets increasingly defined by someone else's expectations or requirements. And all the stuff that might have helped them get to where they want to be in life or would love to be in life ends up falling to the back of their priorities. So this is a really powerful way to think about how you spend your time and making sure there's enough of that spent on things that get you to where you want to be in life. The other thing to know about this though too is not every week looked like this, and there's only a few in any given week that did, or any given month that did. But trying to, on average, get to something like this. And you do have to realize that there are seasons in life that may require this to look meaningfully different. If you're on a project that's 3 months long and it's a sprint and it's just got to get done, it's not going to look like this. And rather than complaining and bitching and moaning about how life isn't what you want it to be, you suck it up and you do it because you're in that season. It'd be like complaining about if you have kids and you're in diaper season. Well, diaper season's going to last for a couple years, and so complaining about that's not a good deal. It's just acknowledge. Or if you're an accountant who's complaining about late nights in March and April, you picked the wrong career. Like, don't complain about it. You chose that. And so just embrace the fact that this is what you've chosen. Don't waste any energy on complaining. But then, when that season's over, make sure you're intentional about getting the time back that you had to give up in order to live through that season. And so acknowledging that things come and go and there are flexes in this can be really powerful into how you sustain yourself through. There are hard times when things may not look exactly like this. This concept of seasons. If the season's 5 years long, that's probably too long. If the season's 3 or 4 months long, that's fine. Some people get into a season where they're like, I'm doing this in order to do that. But this is, I'm going to take a job I hate doing, it sucks the life out of me, I'm going to do it in order to have enough money that someday I can go do the things I want. And those are the people I saw in my career who were 20 years in, waiting to have enough money and time to go do what they wanted, and they were basically wasting the core part of their life. So a big part of this is getting clear on what you want out of your life and then allocating how you spend your time in ways that improve the chances you're going to get that. So home stretch is it. So we could go through all those 10 things in their books, so I won't do that. If you distill it up, as I was kind of thinking back, okay, if you only do a few things, and just took a few things away from even this talk tonight, go ahead and do a couple of clicks here, we'll build this. One is, do the third there, that's good there. There are 3 things that I think of all those things I have on that earlier page that really matter. First one is skills. And skills are really about, what do you become good at? And people can become good at a lot of stuff, because if you spend a lot of time on pretty much anything, you can become good at it. I would argue you should try to become good at things you're passionate about or excited about, whatever word you want to use. Because if you're excited about something, on average, you will do it more than the typical person. If you do anything more than the typical person, the probability of you becoming better at that than the typical person goes up dramatically. And if you're better at pretty much anything, you can find a way to have it be a big part of your life, whether it's making a living doing it or having it just be a core part of what you do, whether that's music or surfing at the wave down here or whatever it might be. And so I think step 1 in building an amazing life is get in touch with what lights you up. For me, it was aviation, so I was lucky. At least it's horses, could be music, could be whatever it might be for any of you. If you get in touch with that, and if you have kids, look for what lights them up. Like our son is an avalanche control guy up at Crystal Mountain, because he loves the mountains. He grew up in Bend, he skied at Bachelor, loves being in the mountains, and now he's an avalanche control guy up in Seattle. If you get good at it, you can do it for your life and make a living at it. And the counter to that is people I see all the time who get good at something they don't really like doing. And unfortunately, you can make a living doing that, of course, but boy, you spend a lot of your time doing stuff, and you'll never be as good as that person who loves doing that same thing. Someone who loves doing accounting, somebody who loves doing law, whatever it might be, they're going to be better than you if they love doing it. So why not pick something you love doing? Relationships, no one ever gets anywhere meaningful in life on their own. If I look back at all the amazing experiences I've had, I can point to individuals who played an outsized role in helping that opportunity come my way. And the way those things happen is you build relationships with people, you invest to get to know people, you invest to help people, you invest to learn from people, and I guarantee everybody loves to share advice, and so you can always get someone to give you advice on some question you might have about your life. And so rather than asking somebody for a job, for example, go ask them for advice. Like, how did you get to where you are in life? What would you do if you were me? And how would you think about this challenge I'm navigating? Doesn't matter how famous or how rich or how whatever they are, I've yet to find someone who's not willing to give time back to help provide a perspective. But in doing that, and if you do the same back, you start to build these relationships with people. And you never know, the 100 relationships you build, there's gonna be one or two where somebody does something, they think of you, they make a phone call, they open the door, they suggest someone talk to you, and next thing you know, you've got an interview, or you've got a job, you've got an opportunity to fly a cool plane, whatever it is. And that's how every opportunity, whether it's Alaska, whether it's the current job I have at AOPA, they come through relationships. It can't be transactional, it can't be you're going to them because you want something from them other than advice. The things you invest in, and over time and over the years, you build a large network of relationships, and through those relationships, opportunities come. And then attitude matters a lot, which is back to what happens between your ears. It's the stories you tell yourself. Not everything will go the way you want it to go, and how you respond when it doesn't go the way you want it to makes all the difference. Like, I wanted to be an airline pilot. I found out I had color vision issues. Airlines weren't going to hire someone with that. I could have blamed, I could have gotten this downward spiral about how it's not fair. Instead, I leaned in and said, okay, what do I do now? Like, what do I do if, despite the fact that, can I go do other things? And turned out I could. I got a first-class medical with no restrictions, all these things, but I had to jump through hoops. And so, looking at life, you can call it through rose-colored lenses, or you can use that technique. What stories do you need to tell yourself that have you see a certain situation in a way where you look on it with a positive attitude? Hey, this thing went bad. All right, what can I learn from it? All right, well, how do I turn this into something better than it seems like it is right now? And that takes practice, because it's really easy. You can allow yourself to get down if something bad happens. But if you can find a way to get yourself out of that and say, what do I do with this? How do I turn it into something? I guarantee if people are hiring someone, every company has issues that go on and challenges, and people are frustrated, they go through layoffs or whatever. There's always challenges. If you're hiring someone and you know you're going to go through challenges, you're going to want every single time to work with someone who's got a great attitude, who's going to look at that challenges as a curious opportunity to do something, as opposed to someone who's trying to find blame and point out why it's not their fault and try to say why this shouldn't have happened, and all those negative things that you can let your mind get into. The person who looks at it in a positive way, people want to be around people like that. More opportunities come your way. So if you can do those things, and I'll leave you with, before you hit the click, there were a lot of opportunities that came my way. A lot I said no to, but I obviously said yes to a bunch, whether it was going to Alaska, whether it was going to business school, walked away from my job to go to business school. I took this job at McKinsey, and then Google, and so on. Even leaving McKinsey to go to Google was not an obvious thing. I was going to take a pay cut to leave McKinsey and join Google. I was getting less cash, I got some equity, but you never know what's going to happen with equity. I was going to lead a 2,000-person team. I had never led a 2,000-person team. The largest team I had led was probably a 7-person team. At a company I didn't know anybody at. So there's a lot of uncertainty around, could I be successful, would I be successful, or should I just stay where I am at McKinsey, where I kind of knew how to be successful, it paid me well enough, I got to live in Oregon, fly my plane to work every week. And so I had a pretty good gig, and there had been someone years ago that had helped me as I was navigating hard decisions, because I would lay out the spreadsheet like all of you would do. They're going to pay me this much cash, this much equity. If I assume this, well, here's how much money I'll make, and if I get a pay raise, I can kind of do a model of how much income I'll have. And you might look at other dimensions too, about promotions or whatever it might be. But at the end of the day, when I click it, someone gave me this quote. Let's see if it comes in. There it is. Someone gave me this quote, and it turned out to be incredibly powerful for me making many of the decisions I've made in my life. Right? When faced with a difficult decision, choose the one that makes for a better story. And it came from a guy who had lived this extraordinary, interesting life. And as I thought about it, definitely with McKinsey to Google, it was like, well, what would be, if I was at McKinsey going from 14 years to 25 years versus leaving McKinsey at 14 years and going to Google for 5 or 10 years, I didn't know how long it would be. What would be a better story? And for sure, going to Google for 5 or 10 years would be a way better story than staying at McKinsey for 25. Same thing back in college. What's going to be a more interesting story? Going on and getting my master's in engineering. I didn't really want to be an engineer. It was kind of always just a backup thing. I enjoyed engineering, glad I did it, but I didn't really want to be sitting in a lab. I loved aviation. So what would be a more interesting story? Finishing out my engineering master's degree or becoming an Alaska bush pilot? Well, Alaska bush pilot is a way cooler story. And even this most recent change, I'm doing well at Cisco. Cisco is a great company. I've been there over 6 years. I could have kept going. And I have this chance to leave and take a substantial pay cut to go lead AOPA. And it's like, well, what would make for a better story? I mean, who gets the chance to lead the largest aviation organization in the world? Gotta say yes, that's a way better story. So, as you all navigate your own lives and find yourself faced with opportunities, I would invite you to at least consider that quote yourself in your own decision making, because for me at least, it's led to this amazing journey through this amazing life that includes living in Bend, Oregon. So go ahead. And I'm going to leave it at that. So I'm just going to say thanks. This is just simply a QR code for a survey. If you have feedback for AOPA, before you leave tonight, take that and give me feedback. The things we're doing great, if you know what we're doing at all, things we could do better. So, but I'm going to wrap up, and I'm happy to take questions, but I'll just thank you all for giving me the time to talk to you and for being here this evening. So thank you.